Hi everybody, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be talking about MVC, or Model View Controller. It's become a very common or popular framework within the web development communities, and there's a lot of frameworks that are built off of it. We're not going to have a lot of time, just due to the nature of the course, to get real deep into it. In fact, I originally started the semester with a lab for MVC, but being that we're in essentially our finals week, our last week of class, I went ahead and took that away. It's still available if you want to work on it and you'd like to send me or interact with me on getting some feedback. That'd be great. But it's not. We're not doing anything for a grade in regards to MVC at this point. My hope with this then is to give you guys just a basic understanding of how MVC works, and we'll primarily do that through an application. And so you can see here on my desktop right now that I have a simple graphic from Wikipedia, but we're going to look at an application here in a few minutes, and I hope that will add a little bit more clarity to the conversation here, or to our discussion on MVC. MVC is one of those frameworks, if you've never worked with it before, and I'm assuming most of you haven't, it takes a little bit, I think, to get used to. It took me the first time that I really started thinking about or working with MVC, building an app and working on a sample application to really understand how it works. And so what I hope, again, by looking at this application later on, is that if you are interested, or if it's not real clear to you, you can set up the application yourself on your VM, on your LAMP stack, and play around with it a little bit on your own. And I think that'll add a lot of clarity to how MVC works. So again, goal today is just a basic understanding. What makes MVC pretty useful, why I think a lot of developers and organizations are switching to this model, is through the way that we structure the code. And one thing that makes it nice is that we have a way in which we more or less isolate how our code is being structured. Previous models, and some that are still very prevalent, would be an end-tier design, and that you have your presentation layer, and maybe your business logic layer, and then your data access layer, and your code then for those appropriate layers live there, right? So presentation, that's where your code goes for how your application presents itself. In our case of a web development or a web application, that would be the HTML, CSS, and our JavaScript. We had the business logic, and that oftentimes then would be in like a web application, or PHP, in that we control how we're accessing data through requests from the user interface. The last piece then would be the model, and those typically are the classes, the things that allow us to interact directly with the database and the tables within that, and pulling that data out specifically. And so we have then a slightly different approach with an MVC framework, and that we have our user being someone that's accessing the site through a browser. We have a controller. And what the controller does then is essentially handles the request from the user. It's kind of like the business logic. The controller then can manipulate, it can instantiate and access the models, the data through the models. And then through this process, the view is being updated. And the view in this case is like our presentation layer. And that the view contains almost exclusively the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript. What makes this a really nice structure is that, as you've probably noticed and gotten a little bit of a sample of with our PHP applications, is that they can get a little convoluted. They can get kind of difficult to work with, and that we have a lot of things that we're kind of meshing together in one file. In one PHP file, we might have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, as well as the PHP, and within that PHP, we might be connecting directly to a database. The sample code that we went through with Lab 8 did all of that. It did all of that in one file. And so it can get really hard to maintain a file like that, because everything can just be lumped together in one file. Now, again, more time we would spend, or if we were looking at a more robust application, we'd spend more time kind of pulling those things apart and having libraries and classes to help separate that logic, make it a little bit more modular, definitely easier to maintain. MVC helps us do that. And so here's just, again, kind of a graphical representation of how that process flows. So keep this in mind here as we go to set up this application, because I hope it will help. I think it will help in understanding how users interact with the application then. All right, so I'm going to have my VM open, and this is where I'm going to go ahead and set up the website. Let's see here. The framework that I've chosen to use for our class here is called Mini, and it's from this author. Another thing that I just wanted to point out here kind of towards the end of the course is that we didn't spend a lot of time, I don't think I even mentioned it until this point, is Git. And Git is a version control software. It allows us to easily collaborate on a code base across a team. And I use it for myself, even as just a sole developer, freelance developer for a lot of things. You'll also notice that GitHub is available on the web. You can go to github.com. Git is the underlying technology. So GitHub is just an online platform that allows us to use Git. And a lot of projects are available on GitHub that are free and open source. They're available publicly for us to use. A lot of employers now are looking at people, developers, as they submit their resumes or their applications for a job. They're looking on GitHub to see what kind of code they write, what kind of activity they have. It's become kind of a social coding platform, as well as organizations. I've worked for a couple of companies now that have used GitHub, specifically GitHub Enterprise, basically, in order to maintain or manage their code, the applications that we were building. So there are some really good tutorials out there. We won't have time to get deep into really to do more with GitHub than just what we're doing right now. But if you haven't used it before, I would encourage you to get out there, take a look at it, explore. And I don't know exactly where the GitHub tutorials are, but they're on the website. If you go to Google and type in GitHub tutorials, great place to start and learn GitHub. I would encourage you to learn GitHub because odds are you'll find it, again, if you haven't used it before, you'll find it as a benefit to yourself, your organization, the code that you're writing. I have nothing but good to say about Git and then GitHub. All right, so for our example then, I posted the link in our reading section, and you can see here that this is a project that was developed by this author, and it is a very scaled down MVC framework. And so I chose this because it is so scaled down. There are much more robust MVC frameworks out there that are available, but for this, I don't want to get kind of bogged down with that. I want to be able to focus on what makes MVC, and I think this allows us to do that. So we're going to set this up as a website, and there's a couple of steps that we have to do. The first thing, if you go this route, is you can set it up via the command line terminal, which is the way that I prefer. In which case, then we need to just get a copy of this URL that's located here off of the project page. You can also download as a zip, and if you go ahead and you download as a zip, then you can essentially set up this website. You can see here that it'll. Here we go. So you can see here, open it up, and there's a bunch of files and folders in there. So it'd be like setting it up like our WordPress site or a Drupal site. So this first step, regardless of what route you take, is simply to get the code downloaded onto our server. So I'm going to use Git. If you need to check if you have Git installed. In Ubuntu, it's not installed by default. If you type in Git at the command line and you get an error, you may have to install it. Pretty easy install, sudo apt-get install Git. That should take care of it for you. You can see that I obviously already have it installed. I want to make sure that, or you want to make sure that you're in your HTML directory where you've put all your other websites. And then all we have to do from here is type in the command git clone that URL that we just copied, and then I'm going to call this folder mini. Right? And so this is the command that we execute. Git clone. Clone means that we're going to make a copy of this repository, a copy of this code. This is the URL, so this is how Git knows. We got that from right here. This is how Git knows where to find this code, that URL, and then this is the name of the folder that it's going to create. So what this is going to do is, because I'm in the HTML folder, it's going to clone all of this code into this directory into a folder called mini. Okay, now, and I have permission errors, so not the greatest way to do this, but I'm just going to go ahead and do sudo for now. Right, and there we go. We should see that it's set up, and if we go to our mini folder, there's all the code. Right, so it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Let's see, from here, next thing I need to do, just like other applications, I need to create a database. And so I'm going to log in to MySQL, and I'm going to create a database, and I'm just going to call it mini. Okay, that's all we have to do there. Next thing that we need to do, you'll notice that there's an install folder. And inside of that install folder, you have 3 files, 01, 02, 03. You need these files, you need to execute these scripts. You can see that they have a .sql extension. That means, and we can take a look at those, is SQL. There are SQL statements inside of here. The first one creates the database if it doesn't exist, mini, and I already did that, so I can actually skip number 1. Number 2, then we'll create the table mini.song. All right, so the song table inside of the mini, and you see that this is SQL, very similar to what we talked about. And so you can do this, you can copy, you can open those files, you could run it through MySQL Workbench if you'd like. Again, because I'm on the command line, I'm just probably going to stay here. And one way that we can get that script to execute would be to say our normal login, then the name of the database that we want to use, and then we use this redirection character, this less than, to say run this script right here against this table using these login credentials. Okay, so now we can hit enter our password, and now it just executed that script. So now we should have a table called song inside of our database called mini. Right, and then the last thing that we need to do is 03. Okay, and 03. It's a little hard to see here, but since this application, the default data is called, it deals with songs. You'll see that in a minute. Here's our insert. So you can see insert into song. These are the columns, and then these are all the values. All right, so that gets us going with the application. Next thing that we need to do is make sure that our application is set up to connect to our database. So under the application folder, there's a config folder, config.php. And if we scroll down a little bit here, much like other config files that we've used, WordPress, Drupal, and others, we need to make sure that we define the username and the password. It's very common when we're dealing with web applications that connect to a database that we have to define that. So you can see, since I use Mini, I don't have to change the database name, I don't have to change the host, and I just needed to update that password. Okay. Last thing I'm going to do then is to create our vhost. So let's see, first we'll edit our host file. I'm just going to call this mini.local, and then after that we'll set up the vhost itself. So Alright, that should be good. Made a change to the config, so we need to restart Apache. Alright, that's normal, looks good. Looking for the OK. Means our config changes were acceptable. We didn't have any syntax errors. And now we can go. We should be able to go to mini.local. See, I made a mistake there. Alright, so I'm going to go back to this file here. Alright, one thing that you'll notice, and this is actually pretty common with MVC frameworks, is that even though, and we can look at this at the kind of the structure of the application. Go to computer and get to our document root here. There's Mini. You can see that this is in a normal application we would set this folder to be the document root, and then we would just have access to all these files. With MVC applications, oftentimes there is an additional folder. In this case with Mini, it's called public, and public is actually where we want to set our document root. And so I went ahead and I made that change. I failed to do that initially, so I made that change to the config. So we'll make it and go ahead and restart again. Now I don't need public in the URL, and now when I go to the site, this is what it should look like. We should see stylings and the pages and everything else. And so now we have the application. We're on the home page, the default, the index. We can go to a subpage. Oh, that didn't work either. So let me just try one thing here. And then if this fixes it, then I will tell you what I did. Oops. Okay, I'm going to have to pause here and figure out the error, and then we'll go through what I did to fix it in just a moment. Okay, so welcome back here. I know that was a seamless pause there, but there was a pause. No matter how many times I set this up, I always forget something. The default security model, so this has to take us a little bit deeper into Apache configs in order to understand what happened. Rewrites are something that you'll very commonly do with a website, and you may have noticed with WordPress or even Drupal that in order to get URLs that look like this, that is, we have home/example1, or we don't have query string parameters. We don't have application index.php $page equals example1. We don't have things like that. In order to get away from this query string driving your dynamic pages, you have to have rewrites enabled, mod rewrite. And so there's a couple of steps that you have to take with Apache. You saw the command that I just typed a few minutes ago, sudo a2 nmod rewrite, and that'll enable it. But oftentimes that isn't enough. And what happens, and again, I don't want to go too deep, so just to point out what happens. Inside of most websites, you'll find this htaccess folder, or file, right? It's a .file. And so in order to see that, we have to type in this command, ls-al, to see. Well, L gives us a listing, and A gives us the hidden files. If we take a look at that file, you'll see that it turns the rewrite engine on, and that it has some rewrite rules. And so Apache by default prevents a website from using rewrites out of an htaccess file, right? Because this is something we can put inside of a website, each individual website, to create different rewrite rules. In order to change that, and again, this is probably the easiest way to do this on a development machine, not necessarily the way that you would want to do it in a production box, but in most cases, you're not dealing with the Apache configurations in a production setting. We've been working with the sites available, sites enabled folders. There is a more root or more core level config file for Apache, and that's just apache2.conf. And so if you go in to edit that file, sudo nano apache2.conf, control W, I'm using nano, so control W allows me to search. What we're looking for is allow override. Right, and then you come into this section here, which is because file numbers are off by default. I'm not exactly sure where we're at in this file, but you'll see there's a couple of directory tags: directory for /, directory for user share, directory for var /. This is the one that we want to modify. Allow override is set to none. If we say allow override to all, then that allows any website to use rewrites inside of that htaccess or that .htaccess file. Right, so I made that change here. So a2 nmod, then went into apache2.conf, made that modification here, and restarted Apache. And now you'll see here that the pages are working. Right, so there are oftentimes a few more steps into getting a website up and running that we haven't necessarily had to go over quite yet. So let's see. So now that we have that set up, we have our application. And we can go to the index page, we can go to a subpage, we can go to another subpage, we can go to songs. And what's important about songs in this particular demo is that this shows us how to do that kind of that dynamic application, with an MVC framework. And so these first two pages are just that. They're just simple pages. They contain static content, much like this home page. But songs is all dynamic. We can search for an artist. Looks like their artist number one is Dina, I don't know. No, track. All right, so I'll put in a value for track. And you can see, well, that didn't really seem to work, but it's supposed to. Functionality does work here, delete. All right, so I just deleted that song. We have a song count. We had 31, now we have 30. We're at 30. If I delete again, of course, we'll go to 29. It's interacting with the database, though, and that's kind of the important thing. The other nice thing about this framework is that, or at least with this demo, is that it's showing us where are the files that if you wanted to modify this, if you want to look at this functionality, where do you go? Well, you go into application view song index.php. That's where everything comes from for this page. And you'll see that with these other pages as well. Application view home example 2.php. And so if you wanted to change that, this is where you'd go in order to do that. All right. As far as the application itself then, we need to look at its overall structure. And so something that you'll notice with MVC frameworks is that we've set up our doc root to be public. And we have an index file, JavaScript, image, and CSS. And this index file, we don't really have to modify any of this. If we were adding JavaScript or images or modifying the CSS, we would. But for our demo, we don't have to. And in order to get to the actual application, the models, the views, and the controllers, we have to go back a directory, and we go into the application folder. Now, other frameworks that you work with won't be set up exactly the same way. But of the handful of MVC frameworks that I've worked with, they've all been very similar to this. All right, so we've already been in this folder, and we have our config.php. You'll also notice then that there are controllers, views, and models. And that's really the important three folders that we want to focus on right now. You have core, and then you have libs. And if you dig into those, you can see that there's not a lot there, but this is what makes, at least for this particular author and this simple framework, these are files that you typically don't have to touch because this is what makes the framework work. What we're going to be looking at are these three folders here. Now, if you think back to that original diagram that we started off with, the place that most applications start is the controller. The controller is what allows us or generates or handles all of the routing for us. And so let me see if I can get text editor open. VM's running awful slow today, so you'll have to bear with me here. So I'm going to open up Sublime Text, and I'm going to open up this application folder inside of that folder view and make that kind of a project. That'll make it a little bit easier to see. So from here, we'll go to Project, and I'll add a folder. Application, there we go. All right, so there we go. So here's our controllers. We have a controller for songs, we have a controller for home, we have a controller for air. And let's take a look at, we don't need to look at air, but let's take a look at home. Right? What do we get? What are we looking at inside of here? Well, this is how all of the pages are handled, all of the requests are handled. In that we have a function, so we have a class home extends controller. This is part of the core. This was set up by the framework author himself or herself. Inside of a controller then, what the functions become are essentially the routes or the pages that we're looking for. And so we have a function called index. And if we go back to the application, this is our index page, home index. And so everything that comes for this page is built with this function. The controller controls the route, controls what's being requested. In order to generate the user interface then, in order to generate all of what the user actually sees, we use the views. And if you think about views in the terms of a template, it's a lot like that. And that we have specific views that we'll use for specific pages. Now, we have in this application, as you probably noticed, that there are things that look the same. The template more or less looks the same. The only thing that is changing is the content that goes in the center of the page. And so we'll have common components. We'll have a header, we'll have a footer, and then the only thing that really changes is that middle template, what is in the middle of the page. So, let's take a look at those views. Right, here we have a view folder. Inside of that view folder, we have a home folder, we have songs, and then we have this underscore template. And so what you'll find here with a lot of MVC applications is that those views are organized by the type of data that they handle. Right? Templates, then header and footer. These are the things that we're going to use across the entire website. And so if we look at header, we can see that here is a template file for just the head. It's just a snippet of the overall page. So here's our head tag, here's the close head tag, here's the style sheets, there are some other meta tags there. Here's the body. This is the navigation. This is navigation that's consistent across the entire site. And so you'll notice that every controller will include header and footer. Header includes basically up to the navigation. Footer includes basically the closing of the document, the closing of the web page. There's the closing body, there's the closing HTML. It includes some script tags, so our script for jQuery, script tag for this URL that they use later on in the application, and then JavaScript for the application itself, which is in JS, application.js. All right, so we go back to our home controller. You can see that this is requiring this again. This is a simple way to do this, but this is including header.php, index.php, and then footer.php. So it's building that page. It's including these files in order to generate that one page that is returned back to the user. Right? So header, index. So we go to home and index, and then this is just the content that goes in the center of the page. So we could change that, of course. I could add some HTML myself. Save it, and now if I go and view that page, there it is. There's the content. I modified this view based off of this path and the path that came from the controller. Right, and so this is where it takes a little bit of time to get used to working with it, because MVC, this type of a framework is a little bit different for most people. And so, again, because we're not going to do a lab for this particular concept, because we're focused on the final this week, you certainly can use it in the final if you'd like. But I would encourage you to take some time and to go through these. Look at the controller, look at the pages, and then look at the views that it's building and that you've built. These views then make it very easy, or make it much easier to make the code a little bit more modular, right? We have a header. This is where all the code for our header goes. If we need to change anything in the header, we just have to come here. We modify it once, and now it's changed across the site. If I want to add an additional link, and I'm going to add just a dummy link here. I save that in that header, in that view, and now I go back to the site. There's our link. No matter what page we go to, it's now included, because all of these pages include that header.php, that view, that particular template file. Same with footer, and really there isn't much to footer other than to include our JavaScript. Right? Home has index, and that is the content then that is replaced in the center. So let's go back to our controller, and let's look at the next controller function, example 1. Right? If we go to our application, we can see in the path we have home/example2, or here, home/example1. And what this is telling the application, how this is working, is that home is telling the application what controller to use, and example 1 is telling it what route to take. So we know, because we have multiple controllers. If we go back and look at our controller folder, we have error, home, and songs. So how do we know? How did I know that we were looking in home? Well, it's because of this path. This first value here is telling us what controller to use. So that's how we know to use the home controller. This is telling us what route to take. You can see here we have one called example 1. Right? So that's how the application is matching those up. Very similar to the last example. Include the header, include example1.php, so we're including a different view for that center content, and then include footer. And so if we go into our view, right, and this right here tells us what view we're using, view home example 1, so view home example 1, here's the code for example 1, that page. Right, same thing then with example 2. If we go back to the application and click on this link, home controller, example 2. Example 2, include the header, include the view for example 2, which is this guy right here. and then include the footer. Right? So we could create another route. Let's say that we wanted to add a link to example 3. All we'd have to do is say public function example 3. I'm going to copy and paste that. Make this example 3. Right, so we'll create a new view in order to handle that. Inside of our view folder then, we'll go under home and we'll create a new file. Call that example3.php. And then inside of here, we'll just put some HTML so that there's something available. Right? Now we want to add that. Let's say that we want to add a link to our navigation. We go to header, and because I already created that, now we can just copy and paste this right here. And example 3 is our route. Example 3. Okay, now if I didn't make any mistakes, we should be able to refresh this. Oh, I did make a mistake somewhere. So let's go back and take a look. Oh, yep, see I didn't define the controller. So home/example 3. So we'll go back here and still got an error. Oh, no, there it is. There it is. So there it is. So relatively straightforward, right? And again, I encourage you to do that. If you want to learn a little bit more about MVC, I hope you do. Do some things like that just to get used to the framework and how it works. The last thing then that we'll look at is the one that has the actual functionality associated with it. Right, so right now we could use MVC and we could build very quickly build a really nice, relatively static site. And that's really behind. If you go to the README for this particular project, that was really the idea behind it, was for people that work in ad agencies or marketing companies that need to develop sites relatively quickly, relatively rapidly. Like using MVC, don't need the overhead of a very big or large MVC framework. So we can add or take a look at that. Right? So we have songs. As you can see here that we just have songs available in the URL. And so when we go and look at the application then, we have a songs controller. From here, you can see that we have the controller songs, and we'll also have our views for songs. And so what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at essentially the same process as before. The only thing that changes is now we can work with our models. The models are what are going to allow us to get information, interact with information from the database, those basic CRUD operations. So for this particular page, we're getting not only the count, but then we're getting all of the songs that are available to be displayed. And so you can see here that we have PHP variable. We say songs equals this model, get all songs, amount of songs equals this model, get amount of songs. This is a little different with this framework, in that because these variables are defined in this function, they're available to the view. And so we have songs and amount of songs. These are PHP variables. Remember, $sign defines a PHP variable. Inside of this view, viewsongsindex.php, you can see that they use, let me find it here, right here, amount of songs. So that's where that data is being passed into that view, as well as this for each loop. And this for each loop is very similar to what we talked about a couple of lectures ago. This is a loop then that is going through that result set, that is going through that collection of objects, and essentially building this grid, building this result set table. Right? And so that's how those values are passed into the view. And so now the view becomes relatively straightforward. It becomes a little bit cleaner. And that, like with our lab 8, we have all of this querying happening inside of the page, and then we do something with the results. Here, we simply pass the results to the view, and then there's just enough code here, enough PHP, in order to help generate the results that we want. In this case, that's every single song out of the database. All right, so how does the model work? That's really what we want to look at here, because that's the difference. Right, we have this call to model, get all songs, model, get amount of songs. And if we look inside of the model folder, there's only one model class. And this model class then, you can see again, it's relatively straightforward. It has a constructor. The constructor creates the database connection object. It does a little bit more because remember, we're dealing with a framework, and so some of the framework code helps to construct this connection for us. But you can see here that we have get all songs. Right? What did we call in songs.php? We called get all songs, and inside of that model then is where that function is defined. There's our select statement. This is a PDO, just like we talked about. So you can see there's the prepare, there's the execute, and then this is what returns that result set. Right. So this variable then is the result set from this statement right here. Right. Add song, delete song, get song, update, get amount of songs, count. We do a count on the ID, and we return that amount of songs. Okay? Right, so that's the basic difference there. This then is how we incorporate the model in order to execute SQL. And you can see that with this example, what the authors were going through, this demo of their framework, was basically all CRUD operations. Here's our select, here's an insert, here's a delete, and then there's our update. Right, so they go through all of those, and so with this as a framework, as an example, it'd be relatively easy to start building off of this and incorporating your data, your database, your schema using an application like this, because it gives you all the basics to get started. Let's see, add song. Right, so this is kind of a similar setup here. And then if we want to add a song, we type in the song name. I'll say that I'm the artist. The track is called track 1, and the link is to google.com. And submit that. And there we go. You can see there is my song been added to the application. And so what it did then was that it called the add song controller. If we look at this post, look at this page. Let's not view selection source. Let's view the source. Okay, come on now. You can see that the action that this is posting to, and I know we didn't spend a lot of time on forms, so the action is where the form is sent to. That data in that form is sent to. In this case, this form contains the artist, the track, and the link. It's the information that we want to submit to the application. And so that is the action, is where do we send that data? In this case, we're sending it to songs add song. And so that's our controller. We have a controller method in songs, right? Because this is our controller class, songs, called add song. And so what this application does, very similar to what we did in our lab, is it looks for a postback, and if so, it gets the values that were put in that form, $_post, and then the name of that form field. So we go back to our form, name artist, name track, name link. So it looks for those values, those postback, and it calls the add song function inside of the model. So if we go to the model, we look at, it goes down here, well, maybe it's right up here, yeah, here we go, add song, we pass those values, artist, track, and link. What does this model method do then? Generates the insert statement, prepares, does the placeholders, and now executes. So again, just like we did, or very similar to what we did in our lab, except that we were doing a select statement instead of an insert. All right, and then you can keep looking at those. All right, and so I would encourage you to continue to look at that. Look at the delete. How does delete work? Well, let's take a look at the link. Mini local songs delete song 3. Right, we need to pass data to the application in order to delete the appropriate song. And so how we do that with an MVC framework, as you can see, there's our controller songs, there's the name of the function that we're going to call delete song, and then we can pass an ID parameter called 3. And so when we click that link, it calls inside of songs the delete song method, that controller method. it expects us to have that song ID, which is in that exact example was 3. And if it's set, then we call delete song, passing that ID to that model method. So we go to model, we look at delete song, there's a parameter, there's the SQL statement, placeholder, prepare, replace that placeholder, song ID, with the value that was passed in, and then execute the query. Right, and then we're done. Once we're done there, we just do a redirect back to songs index. Again, very similar to what we did in the lab. So, all right, well, that was a relatively rapid introduction to MVC. I hope that this gave you some insight into how they worked, or how MVC frameworks work. Controllers control the route, they control the request. The model allows us to interact with the data, and then the views are what we pull together in order to actually generate the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that the user sees. Again, play around with this, spend some time, set up the application. This is, I think, a great, simple framework to get started. If you have any questions, go ahead and let me know. Send me an email. Lab 9 is not due. It's not going to be graded, but if you'd like to work on that, go ahead and do that. I think it would be a great exercise, and if you have problems with that, send me an email as well. If not, that's all I have for MVC, and go ahead and stop the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.